Before commenting on Dr. Warnock's paper, let me just introduce myself and explain my presence here today. As you can probably tell, I don't hail from these parts. I come from New Zealand, where I teach in a religious studies department in a large public university in the capital city of Wellington. I'm in New York this week, which is my third visit to this unique city, to participate in a consultation at Fordham University on Monday on youth incarceration and restorative justice. I'm a New Testament scholar by training and trade, and I've had a long-standing interest in the intersection of biblical theology with criminal justice and human rights concerns. My most recent book is not only on Amazon, it's in the bookstore down at the back of the conference, and I've brought a copy here just to show you, because I'm very proud of the cover, but I won't explain that to you. But it's entitled Compassionate Justice, an Interdisciplinary Dialogue with Two Gospel Parables on Law, Crime, and Restorative Justice. The two parables in the subtitle are the parable of the prodigal son and the parable of the Good Samaritan, the two most famous and influential of all of Jesus' parables, both of which I engage with from the perspective of restorative justice theory and practice. I've been involved in the work of restorative justice in New Zealand for at least 15 years and have just recently been appointed to a new professorial chair in restorative justice at the university I teach at. Restorative justice, as I'm sure many of you will know, is a way of responding to crime that seeks not merely to punish offenders, but to encourage them to restore or repair the damage they've done. It centers on a process that brings together all those who have been affected by an incident of wrongdoing: victims, offenders, their families and supporters, members of the wider community, in a safe and controlled environment with trained facilitators to name the wrong that has been done, to describe how all the parties have been affected by it, to speak about the material and emotional needs it has created, and to resolve together how best to repair the harm and prevent recurrence. Undergirding restorative justice is a distinctive way of thinking about crime, justice, and punishment. Crime is conceived not simply as the breaking of laws, but as the injuring of people and the damaging of relationships. Justice is understood not principally as the administration of punishment, but as the restoration of relationships and the healing of hurts. This understanding of crime and justice is actually very similar to what we find in the Bible, and nowhere more obviously so than in the two great parables just mentioned. The parable of the Good Samaritan is all about the restoration of victims to wholeness, following the trauma of victimization. The parable of the prodigal son is all about the restoration of offenders to community, and the resistance their reintegration encounters from wider law-abiding society. Both parables, I argue, presuppose a restorative rather than a punitive or retributive conception of justice, and therein lies their extraordinary significance to the issues under consideration at this conference. Incidentally, one of the things I discovered in researching the book was how important the parable of the Good Samaritan had been to Martin Luther King. In the first chapter, I offer some brief reflections on Dr. King's famous Beyond Vietnam speech in 1967, in which he memorably declared, "We are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will only be an initial act. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed, so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway." Exactly 1 year later, in the final sermon he ever preached, the "I have been to the mountaintop" speech delivered in Memphis on the day before his assassination, King returned to the story of the Good Samaritan, and at much greater length. This time he appealed to the parable to stress the need to overcome fear and never to neglect engaging individually in situations of injustice, rather than simply convening meetings of the Jericho Road Improvement Association to investigate the causal roots of the problem. Clearly, King's leadership of the civil rights movement and all that it stunningly achieved for this society was energized and informed by his frequent meditation on what he called the magnificent little story of the Good Samaritan. And in my book, I try to read this magnificent little story as a guide for a response to issues of victimhood, crime, and punishment, which brings me then to Dr. Warnock's trenchant critique of the black church for failing to confront the crushing reality of mass incarceration. Mass incarceration, or what a Canadian scholar has called the ever-expanding prison, is without doubt the weeping sore of this country's criminal justice system. Yet the problem is not wholly unique to the US. In New Zealand too, we have seen the inexorable growth of prison numbers over the past 20 to 30 years. In 1987, the rate of imprisonment in New Zealand was 91 per 100,000. That's how the rates are measured, the number of people in prison per 100,000 residents. It was 91. 25 years later, despite a dropping crime rate, it has more than doubled to 197 per 100,000, placing us second only to the US in the developed world. But the US is so far ahead of anyone else that it's not so bad coming second. You are in a league of your own. The current rate of imprisonment in the United States is 716 per 100,000, more than 3 times higher than our shameful rate in New Zealand. But it's worse even than that. The rate of imprisonment for black males in America is 3,074 per 100,000 residents, compared to 459 for white males and 1,258 for Latinos. That statistic alone is enough to justify Dr. Warnock's assertion that mass imprisonment is the most significant manifestation of institutional racism since slavery and segregation and needs to be seen as such. That mass incarceration has nothing to do with the crime rate and everything to do with colour is also evident in my country. The Indigenous Maori population in New Zealand constitutes 15% of the general population, yet over 50% of the prison population. The rate of imprisonment for Maori in New Zealand is 700 per 100,000, about the same as your overall rate, although just still a quarter of your rate for African American males. The same state of affairs pertains in other countries as well. In the United Kingdom, the proportion of black people in prison is 7 times higher than the rest of the population. In Australia, Aboriginal peoples constitute 2.5% of the population, yet 26% of the prison muster. Over and over again, we find the same situation. People of colour are dramatically overrepresented in the criminal justice systems of their respective white nations. This ought to be something of great concern to all Christians, and not least to Christians of colour. Yet, as Dr. Warnock says, it scarcely seems to register on our horizon. Dr. Warnock highlights the theological silence of black churches in the US on the immensely destructive impact of mass imprisonment, and offers 3 reasons for this silence. The privatistic piety of black believers that focuses on individual salvation more than social liberation, an instinctive shrinking from the social stigma of criminalization, and the yawning chasm that now exists between academic black theology and increasingly conservative black spirituality. Once again, this diagnosis is transferable to other societies as well, including my own, where both liberal and conservative churches are obsessed with issues of sexuality and pelvic politics, as it's been called, but disturbingly indifferent to the glaring injustices of our so-called justice system. But let me suggest that there is a significant chink in the armour of Christian disengagement from the issue. That chink is the insistent voice of Scripture, to which all Christians, whether liberal or conservative, claim to listen with special care, at least in theory. the most powerful antidote to Christian quietude on issues of justice and injustice in the penal justice system is what the Bible has to say about such things, and especially what Jesus has to say. If we can show our brothers and sisters in our black and white and Latino and Maori and Pākehā churches what the gospel has to say about crime and justice and imprisonment, what Jesus has to say, then there is hope for change. There is hope for a re-radicalizing of all God's people. There is hope even for sparking a new civil rights movement inspired and informed and authorized by the testimony of Scripture, as it was before. This time, however, it must be a movement not just for civil rights and social justice, but also for penal rights and criminal justice reform. For as Dr. Warnock has convincingly shown, it is in the sphere of penal justice that the blight of racism and institutional discrimination confronts us most urgently today. There can be no advance in social justice for minority communities or people of colour in either of our countries without significant criminal justice reform. There can be no full experience of human liberation without an end to mass incarceration. In his Beyond Vietnam speech in 1967, Dr. King declared that what America most needed at that time was what he called a revolution in values, one which would cause Americans, quote, him to question the fairness and justice of many of their past and present policies. Without a moral and spiritual revolution, he said, America would never be able to conquer what he called the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism. The prison industrial complex is home to all three sinful triplets, and it must be named as sin if ever it is to change. Notwithstanding the present theological silence of the church on mass incarceration, I am convinced that in the biblical tradition and in the power of God's Spirit, we have all the resources necessary to foment a revolution of values in the criminal justice domain. And when that revolution comes, when more and more churches join the global social movement for restorative justice, or what I call compassionate justice, a movement that is already well underway, when that happens, then the prison walls will start to fall and the oppressed will go free. Then will come the acceptable year of the Lord. Thank you.